August 14th, 1944, the Falaise Pocket, Normandy. A German captain from the 2nd SS Panzer Division filed a report so unusual his commander read it twice before sending it up without comment. There was simply nothing useful to say. The captain's observation post on a low ridge had been watching an open wheat field since 4 in the morning. The field was 300 meters across, flat, cut so low that even a crouching man would have been spotted instantly. His sentries had kept their eyes on it without a single break. No movement was recorded. Not a single shot had come from that direction. Yet, at 6:20 a.m., a British sniper shot the company commander from inside that very field. The range was estimated at 180 meters, and the shooter vanished before they could even fire back. The lookout post saw absolutely nothing go in. They saw nothing come out. When his men searched the field 40 minutes later, they found it completely empty. Deep in the mud at the center, they found only 2 shallow elbow prints and a few bent stalks of wheat. That was it. The captain had absolutely no idea how to explain it. His report expressed this in the stiff, formal tone of a professional soldier trying to write down something that defied all standard military logic. He noted that the British sniper must have been hiding in a spot his sentries swore was empty for hours before he finally pulled the trigger. He added that his men could find no trace of how the marksman had entered or left the area. He ended the report with a single sentence that his commander heavily underlined. The camouflage method used does not match any British infantry tactics we have ever faced before. He was right. It did not. If you find this historical mystery compelling, please take a quick moment to like this video. It truly helps these historical videos reach an audience that cares about them, and subscribe for more stories. Because the mystery of that Normandy field in August 1944 did not come from any official army tactics. It was not printed in any manual the British War Office had published, nor was it taught at Aldershot, Catterick, or any other standard training camp in England. Instead, it was born from a devastating crisis so humiliating and costly in human lives that a small group of men spent nearly 2 decades quietly rebuilding a British military tradition from the brink of extinction. The German forces who kept writing those panicked reports in Normandy, in the Western Desert, in Italy, and across the rugged Gothic line were facing the lethal results of that rebirth without ever understanding its origins. To understand how this happened, we must look at one specific number. That number is 1,400. That is how many British officers and commanders were killed or wounded by German sharpshooters in just the first 6 months of World War I. Not ordinary soldiers, but key leadership figures. Targets identified by their confident posture, their gestures, or the way they read maps and held binoculars. The German army entered that conflict with a highly organized sniper program, deploying trained marksmen with scoped rifles to every unit, with orders that specifically prioritized wiping out enemy officers and battlefield leaders. The British Army went into that very same war with absolutely nothing of the sort. In 1914, British High Command viewed sniping, hunting individual targets from hidden positions as ungentlemanly, unsporting, and a tactic fit only for rebels, not professional soldiers. They had zero sniper training. They issued no scoped rifles to their men. There was no actual camouflage doctrine beyond the basic rule of keeping one's head down in a trench. The result was a one-sided slaughter that is hard to comprehend. German marksmen fired from well-hidden positions with complete impunity. Any British soldier who peeked over the trench wall was targeted with a deadly accuracy that survivors wrote about as just another routine horror, like the mud and the rats. On the Western Front, some British units lost an officer every single week for months on end to sniper fire alone. Yet for the first 2 years of the war, the British military leadership did almost nothing to stop it. However, a few observant men watched this tragedy unfold and refused to accept it. The most crucial figure among them was actually a civilian, a writer, adventurer, and one of the greatest marksmen of the Edwardian era. His name was Hesketh Vernon, Hesketh Prichard. What he accomplished next would echo through 2 global conflicts and eventually trigger that bizarre German report in a Normandy wheat field decades later. Prichard had spent years hunting dangerous game across South America, northern Canada, and the vast plains of East Africa. He understood, with the deep instinct of a veteran tracker who had stalked prey across open terrain for thousands of hours, Let us look at two things the British military establishment of 1914 entirely failed to grasp. First, that a soldier in the open is not visible by default. He only becomes visible when he moves, silhouetting himself against the sky or disrupting the natural rhythm of the landscape around him. Freeze, break your outline, and become part of the ground, and you will disappear in terrain that seems to offer no cover at all. Second, they failed to realize this was a learnable skill, yet it could only be learned from experts who had already spent years mastering it, since no manual could ever capture what an experienced stalker does instinctively when reading the ground. It had to be demonstrated. Hesketh Prichard fought the War Office for 2 years before anyone listened. When they finally gave him permission to proceed, he built the first military sniping school at Lingham in 1916. The instructors he recruited were not typical military men at all. They were professional deer stalkers from the rugged Scottish Highlands, men who spent their lives on the open hillsides of Sutherland and Wester Ross, guiding clients after red deer in terrain where the animals could spot a man from 600 meters, where the only way to get close was to read every contour of the hill and every shadow line, and reading wind shifts with near-scientific precision. Drop a like on this video if you love history. These were the legendary Ghillie men. Historically, a Ghillie was a Highland estate worker whose job included, among other things, building camouflage so incredibly perfect that a man lying in it was invisible from just inches away. The ghillie suit, that famous garment made of burlap strips and brush that breaks up the human outline, was not actually a military invention. It was a tool developed over generations of Highland hunting, refined across centuries of navigating terrain that looked, to untrained eyes, to offer absolutely no cover. Hesketh Prichard took these men and their methods to build a formal curriculum. By the end of 1916, his school had trained over 6,000 British and Allied snipers. The massive German advantage in hidden marksmanship, which had been almost absolute in 1914, was finally reduced to rough parity by 1917. German marksmen who had hunted freely for 2 years began dying in their own hides, eliminated by Allied snipers who had learned to read the very ground hiding them. But the school closed after the war, and that hard-won knowledge quickly vanished. The officers who understood what Hesketh Prichard built retired or passed away. By 1939, the British Army had, with an almost willful consistency, forgotten nearly every lesson it had learned. The designated sniper units that existed on paper were severely undertrained and under-equipped. Sniping doctrine and fieldcraft had decayed back into the stiff parade ground rules that had cost so many lives a generation prior. When British forces clashed with the German army in France in 1940, the old imbalance quickly returned. As we look back, there is a cold, institutional logic to this, forgetting organizations only remember what keeps them safe today. In the peace years, military sniping no longer seemed urgent, so his hard-won knowledge vanished. If you enjoy deep historical dives, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It was only saved by a small group of stubborn officers and the unique nature of the British Empire's global military reach. In 1939, Britain was not just an island. It spanned Kenya, India, Palestine, and Malaya, among other territories where officers spent entire careers hunting in environments that made the Highlands look like a city park. These were men who had tracked tigers in India, leopards in Kenya, and game across the rugged northwest frontier. They had learned, much like Hesketh Prichard had once learned in Patagonia, that the landscape is never just dirt and grass. It speaks clearly to anyone who knows how to listen. When the sniper schools were finally resurrected between 1942 and 1943, these veteran hunters led the charge. The curriculum they built drew heavily on Prichard's original principles and the ancient Highland stalking tradition, reviving the ghillie suit, the hidden sniper nest, and the tactical crawl. Yet, they added a massive wealth of fieldcraft that earlier schools lacked, lessons learned by men who spent careers reading wild, non-European terrains. Wild landscapes with vastly different textures and vegetation. Their world of shadows and angles differed completely from the neat English countryside. These men learned to read the terrain at a level their own culture had never prepared them for. The Lovat Scouts, recruited mostly from Highland gamekeepers and deer stalkers, became the British military's master instructors in sniper craft and camouflage. Their true genius was not marksmanship, though they were deadly shots. It was complete invisibility. A scout could build a perfect hide in any terrain in under 3 minutes using only local brush and dirt. They could slip across open hillsides in broad daylight, completely undetected by observers who knew they were coming. Their fathers had spent 30 years teaching them how deer perceive the world, and how to use that knowledge in reverse. A scout could lie perfectly still in a shallow ditch for 4 hours without shifting weight. That is because stalking a red deer to within 80 meters on an open Scottish hillside demands a patience no 8-week military camp can teach, but a lifetime of survival makes automatic. By 1944, soldiers trained in these tracking methods were scattered throughout British infantry units across every battlefront. They were not an elite unit. Instead, they served in regular scout and sniper platoons, taught by legends whose tracking lineage reached back through Hesketh Prichard to the Highland hills and the African bush. When these men crawled into a French wheat field or a Tunisian valley, they were not simply following military doctrine. They were using an inherited way of seeing that the opposing German officers could not possibly comprehend. The German captain, who wrote that report at Falaise, was a product of a world-class military training machine. He understood camouflage as traditional European warfare defined it. He knew how to spot cover, how to zero his artillery on it, and how to turn open fields into a death trap. What he could never have known was that the sniper who took out his company, commander, was trained by masters who studied the Highland deer and the African leopard, men who had looked at that empty, harvested wheat field and found a clever path of approach he would never have imagined. Ultimately, the German military machine was brought down by several critical factors. Overwhelming numbers, massive factories, strategic mistakes, and enemies on every front. But in the tall grass of Normandy, the dry hills of Tunisia, and the steep slopes of Italy, they were also defeated, repeatedly and mysteriously, by an invisible threat they could not find. They were beaten by soldiers trained to merge completely with the earth, not by textbooks, but by inheritance. By a heritage of reading the earth so deeply that no formal army had ever thought to write it down, learn it in wild places where regular armies had never set foot. Desperate reports piled up. Different battlefields, different years, yet every commander used the same bewildered words. We cannot see them. We do not know how they enter or leave. We search the area and find nothing but tracks in the mud. They were telling the truth. Subscribe now to uncover more hidden history